Hello everyone, welcome to the 2019 Reds release video. This is a really interesting vintage, especially coming after the wet year that we had with the 2018 Reds, which came out really nicely, but they were kind of a struggle. So 2019, these wines were, I guess, in a way more cooperative and easier vintage to work through. Uh, Conditions were impressive to make big, bold, really concentrated red wines. So the story on that is going to be that we had kind of classic like rain in the spring, vines grew well, and mid-summer it just went dry, really dry, and it stayed that way to the point that vines in the field are turning yellow. You risk issues with younger vines needing water, and really put the vines into an early as I've ever seen outright shutdown of growth. There's good and bad to this. Fortunately, we got just a little bit of rain in August that kept the vines going well enough to where we didn't actually have like damage to the vines. But it induced really early with the vines shutting down concentration in the fruit. It initiates a desiccation or a dehydration cycle in them. And again, with the rain we got, vines stayed okay, but the fruit didn't actually kind of bounce back and rehydrate. It stayed in this drying condition status for all the rest of the season. So this really results in overall concentration. So some really interesting features in the wines. And when you get dehydrated fruit, everything concentrates. Sugars concentrate higher, acids, phenolic characters. You basically have less water in the grapes, so everything else intensifies. I'm going to go through the wines briefly and some of them in pairs so that we kind of understand the different genres. And as is appropriate, I'm going to add some other feedback on the season. The first two wines in our pairings are going to be Cabernet Franc and Petite Syrah. They're more what I normally call the medium weight reds. Cabernet Franc is a small run this year because a lot of that went into rosé. I am rebuilding the quantities of the dry Cabernet Franc red program, but right now it's kind of a small run. But the Cab Franc is just really nice, classic, very berry expressive, great fruit depth, smooth, just really pleasant, really lovely. Not over the top in terms of alcohol like some of the other wines. It's closer to 14.5% alcohol, but really smooth, pleasant, and balanced. The Petite Syrah is a really interesting vintage because most of the time it comes in the same medium weight genre as the Cabernet Franc, and it's what I describe more as a French styled Petite Syrah because it's from the Rhone, and it often for us has kind of a rustic characteristic to it, and is not usually the same as those dry climate California Petite Syrahs that some of us might be familiar with. But in this vintage, instead of being plumper, bigger, juicier berries as usual, the Petite Syrah vines actually did shut down and dehydrate also. So the desiccation in that fruit pushed concentration up significantly. So it is much more reflective of what you would think of as a denser characteristic Petite Syrah. Not over the top, like bold power, but definitely has that like drier climate influence on it, really came through. So it's really pleasant also because it coincidentally doesn't normally develop a real high sugar, which means it doesn't normally result in an extremely high alcohol. It's still held to that this year, which was really nice and pleasant. So it's much lower in its alcohol. I've got it labeled on the bottle at 13 and a half, which is probably about right in this vintage. So not super high, really pleasant, really like this. I think this is actually probably one of the stars of the vintage, and really shines in terms of our vintage comparisons of Petite Syrah. Really nice. From there, we cross into a whole different genre of wines with the bigger wines. So I'm going to talk specifically about Petit Verdos, Tanats, and then the new wine that we have, the Trilogy, which some of you have already had. We had to get something out on the flight a little sooner. Trilogy was one that I chose because it was a newer wine that we hadn't had before. So all of the Petit Verdot, Tannat, and Cab Sauv all ripened to right around like 29, 30 bricks. Some of the Tannat's a little bit higher than that. This is right on the threshold of what's fermentable as a dry wine. So this means these wines all came out right around 17% alcohol, really intense. This actually balances pleasant and fine for Petit Verdot and Tannat. They retain enough acidity, that deep, dense purple characteristic comes through. They're lovely and they handle it perfectly fine. Cabernet Sauvignon, on the other hand, we went with and gave it a try as the vines were starting to get a little bit more age on them to make it into a red wine, being a good year. And Cabernet Sauvignon doesn't have that same acid retention and deep purple, vibrant concentration to it on its own. It's usually actually, without cellar manipulation, more of a medium weight red wine. So the Cab Sauv tasted hot, high alcohol, low acid, super dry. So in order to make that pleasant, we actually had a stroke of luck that there were some blending components that were going to go with that. So the Trilogy bottle, you probably can't see it, but that one is labeled on the back of the bottle, has the blend, and it's named this because it's 3 grapes from 3 vineyards. So the Cabernet Sauvignon is from our site. That is offset blending beautifully by Verdo, which comes from my good friend Karim's vineyard at Hillsborough Vineyards. He had just a touch more than he needed in that season. It's one of his star wines that he calls Bloodstone, and really worked beautifully because it's very reminiscent of Malbec, so it blends similarly to the way I've blended Malbec in the past, that it has a nice acidity to it, a lower alcohol to it, really fresh, fruity characteristic to it. So the lower alcohol, higher acidity offset really nicely the Cabernet Sauvignon to have those meet in the middle and balance properly. And then the way that I operate is if you've got Petit Verdot, you put it in things because all it can do is make things better. So there's a little bit of Petit Verdot thrown in there also. So this is a new and different wine for us, being based on Cabernet Sauvignon. It is much more reminiscent of a classic Bordeaux style wine. So that's not something that I've always done. It's something we might be able to do some years and not other years. Kind of depends on the season and how things go, whether we make the Cab Sauv into red wine or rosé, or if it gets sold. Kind of depends on the season. After that, we get into 3 wines that kind of match up and are really interesting. We've got the Petit Verdot, the Empora Petit Verdot, and the Tannat. Okay, so these are grapes that naturally desiccate even in regular years, and so the desiccation and concentration is a little more intense in a season like 2019. So these are like big reds. I don't think any of these are something that you would normally try and think, oh, that's a Virginia red wine. They're quite comparable to the boldness that you get out of dry climates. They're quite comparable to the intensity that is usually achieved with cellar manipulation techniques of bleed off the saignée, where you actually remove juice in order to intensify a wine, to have less juice with more skins. I don't ever do any of that because we like to keep things in their natural state, but these show all those characteristics of big, bold wines. These and then the Crooked Run that follows after it are all labeled at 17% alcohol. It's pretty much spot on accurate, and it's pushing right up against the limit of what we can take dry. The late harvest Tannat, when we have that, is usually 17 and a half, maybe approaching 18. I label it 18. So these are high alcohol wines from Petit Verdot on down this flight. So they are to be respected for the fact that they're going to hit. Otherwise, to describe them individually, the Petit Verdot is classic, like that smooth back, super dark, jammy, big volume up front, all those great things to it. I absolutely love it. Then we have our second vintage of the Empora Petit Verdot. So it's got that cool amphora right up on top of the That's a real small production run. That's a 30 case run because that comes out of that smaller Empora. Um, Again, really interesting what the amphora does to it. We have two amphora now. One is a traditional amphora that this was in that is significant breathing, more so than a barrel. So there is an oxygen influence of the wine. We've more or less concluded that what that does is it softens the wine. It takes kind of that like bright tart edge off of it and gives you a much more subdued, mellow, soft characteristic to it. Maybe a little bit more of a rustic. Definitely, you can see the similarity to traditional, more like ancient technique style of amphora wines. Very reminiscent of classic amphora wines. Really cool. I'm not going to say one's better than the other because I definitely know out of all you out there that might be watching this, some of you are going to like one, some of you are going to like the other, and that's perfectly good and the way to go. With the softness, that amphora one is perceptibly drier. It's kind of interesting. The Tanat then next, just to jump right in and keep moving. Tanat is your classic, like big, bold, dense, intense, complete palate profile. Great. It's actually only a small production of Tanat because sugar's pushed so high that a much larger portion than usual of Tanat went into the late harvest Tanat bottling. Some goes into the Crooked Run blend. But a lot of the fruit was picked at 32, 33 bricks, which is similar to percent sugar, and picked at the same time. So it's labeled late harvest because we understand that late harvest wine means it's a naturally sweet wine. That's what this is. But it wasn't actually picked later in this vintage. They were picked at the same time. There was a split in both of our vineyard blocks between one half being a little bit more moist and fertile soil produced the drier Tanat, the other half being a weaker, excessively well-drained soil that produces smaller vines and smaller yields and shuts down and dehydrates the fruit to a more extreme, went into the late harvest Tanat. So there was a split within both my front field and my back field vineyard blocks of Tanat and which way it went picked at the same time. It was really interesting because even picked at 32, 33, that's just enough to do the late harvest Tanat. But as the fruit was in the fermenters, there were so many berries that were so raisined from dehydration that day after day, as the juice was rehydrating the sugar in those berries that didn't have any water, the sugar in that juice kept going up. So it was kind of impossible to ever get an actual final number on what that sugar content was of that juice because it kept going up as fermentation would start and be pulling it down. And so going up while coming down, who knows what that number was actually ending up. So maybe it's a touch sweeter than other late harvest Tanats. But this kind of happened, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, in the Petit Verdo and the Tanats also. But last one to introduce individually and then give you the concept I'm talking about is the Crooked Run. This is really nice. So this one is blend listed on the back also. We've got Tanat, Petit Verdo, Petite Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon, named after the Crooked Run stream, which is down at the bottom of the property. You cross it on that bridge every time that you come to see us, and that's what we call our estate vineyard blend, Crooked Run. So it is just blended to show the overall highest potential of the site once blending bypasses the characteristics of individual grapes as the dominant feature. So usually I love the single varietals because I find them distinctive, interesting, unique. That fascinates me, what they taste like year to year on a given site. But this is really cool to see once we overcome the individual varietal, what the complete wine potential is for a given vineyard site. So I find that one really interesting as a blending approach. I will mention though that in the dry wines that are really high alcohol, so we're talking about the Petit Verdos, Tanat, and Crooked Run, they are having several features come together that create this perception in your palate drinking them that maybe, maybe not. They're like borderline. Are they? Could they be a little bit sweet? Maybe not. It's hard to tell. This is a really complicated thing because it isn't just are these wines sweet or not. There's a number of factors contributing to this. Four specifically that, if I remember them all, I'm going to mention to you right now. So, one is that native yeast fermentations, in addition to the wide, broad profile that I talk about, also create that rich texture, which I describe as like a viscous feel, almost like a chewiness, thickness to it. So this is often reminiscent of what you would think of as sweet wine being thicker, but native yeast does this in dry wines. So I've had for years, especially with reds, people taste the dry reds and say, it tastes sweet to me, when they're not actually sweet. Part of it is just this native yeast thicker characteristic that comes through in the wine. Next is as soon as you get above about 14.5% alcohol, the wines, the yeast actually start to produce a different molecular form of alcohol. It is called a higher order alcohol. A higher order alcohol is described academically, textbook style, as perceived as sweet. So the higher you go above 14.5, and these are right about 17, that alcohol, which is technically not sweet, perceives as sweet. So you've got level 2 put on there. Third, acidity is always pronounced in my wines, especially when they're young, because they're not masked by new oak. The acidity is no different in my wines than other wines. Usually you don't notice it because the new oak just steamrolls it and distracts you, and you can't even see what's going on in the rest of the wine. So you get the oak out of the way, and you can actually taste the grapes and the characteristics that are in the wine. Much more interesting. But they often then, especially young, right at release, have that like bright freshness to them from the acidity. So in the equation of sweet, dry, any of that, it is notable that tart makes people think sweet, even when it's not, because fruit is tart and you think fruit is sweet. And in terms of whether or not it's dry, something that's more tart perceives less dry, something less tart perceives drier. So this is the case across alcohols, distilled spirits, wine, all that kind of stuff. So that's 3 characteristics going on. Fourth is we really hit that point where we almost couldn't quite get them dry. And I really couldn't, like I said, generate a number, a measurement at the beginning pre-fermentation of how much sugar was in these grapes and juice because it kept going up. So it was just cross your fingers and roll and go. So I think some of them actually have this like approaching the threshold of, almost a perceptible residual sugar, but I don't think when you actually break these wines down that what you're tasting is sweet. I think you're tasting a characteristic that comes across the board from the complexity of all these different features, and it just kind of makes your brain think this. So you're all going to perceive that differently, but I think it's interesting to talk about and see because it is a vintage characteristic. It is different, I would say, for us at Arterra than a lot of the other wineries. You take a year like 2019, most people are super excited that all of a sudden their fruit's really ripe this year, more so than it would normally be. Whereas at Arterra, we're on extremely well-drained, high-quality sites that can ripen fruit properly every year. And we start each year farming to reduce shoot density and crop load at the very beginning of the season so that we have a much lower crop load by the time we set berries in early June to have ripening focused on a much smaller yield, accelerates that ripening on a smaller crop load, concentrates those ripening characteristics. It's really an approach that is preparing for a year to turn bad at any point in time. When it doesn't, and then it really concentrates like 2019, it almost goes too far with our sites and our approach in terms of the response to a year. I am actually a lot of times a fan of kind of like a middle ground kind of a year in Virginia because Petit, Verdo, and Tannat love regular years in Virginia. So you combine this effect with how we intend to stress the vines most years. So once the canopy's set and the fruit is set, we let those weeds and grasses and everything grow underneath the trellis. And this is important because this is going to shift the vine from vegetative growth, happy, thriving, thinking this is a great place to be, to stressing it. When you stress the vine, its cue is going to be that this is a bad place to live. If I stay here, I might die. So I want to move. And the only way I can move is seed dispersal. So the vines will stop growing and take the energy that they've developed in the canopy, pull that back down into the fruit, and utilize everything that it has in its regular tree type infrastructure and give everything it's got to that fruit. It's trying to maximize color, flavor, and aroma to attract animals from further away to eat that fruit, carry off that seed, and deposit it somewhere else as a better chance of survival. So when you take an already extreme season like 2019, combined with a really good site, combined with these management practices that are meant to be ready for a bad year, it really just creates these like really big, really powerful, really interesting wines. So I think this is a great experience. I think these wines are going to age amazingly. All these features that might show up in their youth are going to integrate and mellow themselves out over another year or two of aging really nicely as usual. So I invite you to check these out, enjoy them. I think they're great. They're going to sell really well. And that's that. So thanks for listening.